Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was the new hope after the fall of the Justice League. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world was ending in a symphony of screams and shattered concrete. For Izuku Midoriya, codenamed Deku, the battlefield was a maelstrom of raw sensation. The air tasted of ozone and pulverized stone, a gritty cocktail that coated his tongue and burned his lungs. The sounds were a chaotic opera, the guttural roar of Nomu, the sharp crackle of Kaminari's electricity, the wet, sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground, and above it all, the chilling, almost gleeful laughter of Tamura Shigaraki. His body was a map of agony. A deep burn seared across his left shoulder where a jet of acid had grazed him. His ribs screamed in protest with every sharp breath, souvenirs from a high-speed collision with a chunk of flying debris. The iron bracers on his arms were dented and scorched, the metal groaning under the strain of channeling One for All. But the pain was secondary, a dull background hum to the frantic, high-frequency thrum of his purpose: protect, evacuate, contain, save. The mantra, hammered into his soul by All Might, by Gran Torino, by the very legacy of the quirk thrumming in his veins, was the only thing keeping him moving. Ground team, report. He yelled into his comm, his voice hoarse. Endeavor is pushing Shigaraki back toward the bay. We need a clear evac corridor for the west quadrant. Static answered, punctuated by a scream that was cut unnervingly short. His heart seized. They were losing. Despite everything, despite the sacrifices, the blood, the sheer, desperate willpower of hundreds of heroes, Shigaraki's wave of decay and his legion of monsters were overwhelming them. He spotted a flicker of movement in a half-collapsed office building. A family, a mother, a father, a small child clutching a stuffed rabbit, cowering behind a slab of concrete as a hulking, four-armed Nomu smashed its way toward them. There were no other heroes nearby. It was him. It had to be him. Danger senses screaming, he muttered, the familiar electric prickle washing over his brain. It wasn't just the Nomu. Something else was wrong. He ignored it. The family came first. One for all, 30%. He roared, green lightning erupting around him. He used FA gene, storing kinetic energy in his legs before releasing it in a single, explosive burst. The world became a green-tinted blur. He was a comet of righteous fury, closing the distance in a heartbeat. The Nomu turned, its vacant eyes fixing on him. It was fast, swinging two meaty fists in an arc meant to pulverize him. Deku twisted in midair, a maneuver that sent daggers of pain through his ribs. He uncoiled Black Whip from his right arm, the dark tendrils lashing out with a life of their own. They weren't just whips, they were extensions of his will. They wrapped around the Nomu's arms, pulling taut. Simultaneously, he used Float, the quirk of the seventh user, Nana Shimura, to halt his forward momentum and hang suspended in the air. He had a clear shot. Manchester. Smash! He drove his armored boot into the Nomu's exposed back. The impact was like a thunderclap, the force traveling through the creature's spine. It spasmed, its monstrous frame folding before it was blasted through the far wall and into the street below. He landed softly, the pain in his body already a distant echo. He turned to the family, his signature, reassuring smile, a conscious imitation of All Might's, already forming on his face, despite the blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. It's okay now, he began. URSA. That was when the world broke. It wasn't Shigaraki's decay. It wasn't an explosion. It was a silent, geometric wrongness. A tear appeared in the air beside him, not a swirling vortex like Kurogyiri's warp gate, but a precise, crystalline fracture in reality itself. It didn't churn, it simply was. From it spilled not darkness, but an absence of color, a patch of visual silence that absorbed the light around it. He saw Kurogyiri on the far side of the street, his misty form flickering erratically as several heroes tried to subdue him. His warp gate was open, a swirling purple nebula, but it was colliding with this thing. The two energies met, and instead of one overpowering the other, they reacted. A discordant hum filled the air, a sound that vibrated deep in Deku's bones, a frequency that felt ancient and utterly alien. His danger sense didn't just prickle, it detonated, a psychic scream of absolute, imminent peril. The fracture expanded, lashing out like a shard of glass. It touched the edge of Kurogiri's gate, and the resulting feedback was catastrophic. The purple vortex destabilized, imploding and exploding simultaneously into a chaotic storm of spatial energy. A wave of pure force, neither physical nor quirk-based, slammed into Deku. It didn't throw him back. It pulled him in. His vision fractured into a million kaleidoscopic pieces. He saw the terrified faces of the family he just saved, stretching and distorting. He heard the voices of the one for all vestiges screaming in his mind, not in words, but in a chorus of pure, primal warning. He felt a tearing sensation, as if his very atoms were being unspooled from the fabric of his world. He reached out, a desperate, instinctual gesture, his fingers grasping at the fading light of his home. Then, there was only the silent, screaming void. Pain was the first herald of his return to consciousness. A dull, throbbing pain that started in his head and radiated outward to every nerve ending. The second was the rain. It was a cold, persistent drizzle that felt greasy on his exposed skin, each drop carrying the grime of the city with it. Izuku Midoriya groaned, forcing his eyes open. The world swam into focus, a smear of dark, wet shapes. He was sprawled in an alley, his cheek pressed against cracked, gritty asphalt. The reek of stagnant water, rotting garbage, and something vaguely chemical filled his nostrils. It was a far cry from the clean, orderly streets of Mizurufu he was used to, even in its most neglected corners. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. His suit was in tatters. The green fabric was ripped across his chest and legs, revealing the dark compression shirt underneath. His cowl was gone, likely lost in the chaotic transit. The metal plates on his gloves and boots were scarred and twisted. "Comms," he rasped, his throat raw. He fumbled for the side of his head, where his earpiece should be. His fingers met only tangled, wet hair. He searched his utility belt. The casing of his main communicator was cracked, the screen dark and unresponsive. Useless. He was alone. Injured, disoriented, and completely, utterly alone. He leaned against a brick wall, its surface slimy with moss and filth, and took a proper look at his surroundings. This wasn't Japan. The architecture was all wrong. Towering buildings of dark stone and steel clawed at the perpetually overcast sky, their facades adorned with grotesque gargoyles that seemed to weep the endless rain. Skeletal fire escapes clung to the walls like rusted iron ribcages. The language on the faded, peeling posters was English. America? The thought was a lifeline. He'd been transported overseas. It was a massive leap, but it was explainable. A quirk accident. A very, very bad one. "Okay, Midoriya. Think," he whispered, forcing his mind into analytical mode, just as Sir Night Eye had taught him. Assess the situation. Find a hero agency. Find a police station. Establish contact with Japan. Get home. The plan sounded simple, logical. But a deep, unsettling feeling coiled in his gut. The atmosphere of this place was more than just gloomy. It was oppressive. The windows of the surrounding apartments were like vacant eyes, dark and lifeless. There was a palpable sense of despair clinging to the very air, a heavy blanket of cynicism that made the back of his neck prickle. He looked up, searching for the familiar shape of a hero patrol in the sky, a colorful costume against the gray clouds. There was nothing. Only the rain, the stone, and the silence. A sound from the mouth of the alley jolted him from his thoughts. A woman's sharp, fearful gasp. Peering around the edge of a large, overflowing dumpster, Deku saw a scene that was brutally, depressingly familiar. Two men, burly and dressed in worn-out street clothes, had a woman cornered. One of them held her by the arm, his face a mask of casual menace. The other was brandishing a weapon, but it wasn't a knife or a gun. It was a sleek, metallic baton that glowed with a faint blue light, crackling with contained energy. The air around it shimmered. "Just give us the purse, lady," the first man grunted, his voice devoid of any real malice. "It was just business." "And the watch." "Don't make us get ugly." The woman, tears streaming down her face, shook her head. "Please, it's all I have. My kids." The second man sighed, an exaggerated, theatrical sound of annoyance. He raised the energy baton. Look, we ain't got all night. The LCC patrols swing by here every 20 minutes. Now the purse, LSEC? The name meant nothing to Deku, but the threat was clear. And the sight before him, it lit a fire in his soul that no amount of pain or confusion could ever extinguish. This was it, the fundamental truth of his existence. Someone was in trouble. A hero was needed. He didn't think. He acted. He pushed off the wall, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs. He didn't have time for a grand entrance, or a powerful smash. He needed speed and precision, F.A. Gene. He stored the energy in a single step. One for all, 20%. The green lightning was a faint, almost invisible flicker in the dim light. To the criminals and their victim, it was as if the shadows themselves had come to life. One moment, they were alone. The next, a green and black blur shot out from the side of the alley. The man with the energy baton didn't even have time to register the movement before a powerful force slammed into his wrist. The sound was a sharp crack of bone. The baton flew from his numb fingers, clattering uselessly against the pavement. He screamed, clutching his shattered arm. Deku didn't stop. His momentum carried him forward in a fluid, controlled spin. He planted one foot and used Black Whip. A single, razor-thin tendril of dark energy erupted from his arm, not to strike, but to snatch. It coiled around the first man's ankle with surgical precision and yanked. The man's feet were swept from under him, and he hit the wet ground with a surprised grunt, his grip on the woman lost. The entire sequence took less than a second. Deku landed in a low crouch between the would-be muggers and their victim, his back to her, a protective wall of flesh and blood. The green lightning of One for All now crackled more visibly around him, a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom of the alley. He rose to his full height, his gaze hard as he looked at the two groaning men on the ground. "You're done," he said, his voice low and steady. It was the voice of a seasoned hero, not the stammering boy he once was. He then turned, the hard lines of his face softening instantly. The All Might smile, genuine and radiant, bloomed on his face. He extended a hand to the terrified woman, who was now pressed against the wall, her eyes wide as dinner plates. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with sincere, earnest concern. "Are you hurt?" This was the moment he expected relief. Gratitude. The familiar, tearful thank you that made every broken bone and sleepless night worthwhile. He did not get it. The woman recoiled as if his hand were a venomous snake. Her breath hitched, and her wide eyes weren't filled with relief, but with pure, unadulterated terror. What are you?" she stammered, her gaze flickering from his glowing form to the two men he dispatched with such impossible speed. Deku's smile faltered. "I'm a hero. I'm here to help." "A hero?" She repeated the word like a foreign curse. No, they're all gone. You're one of them. A meta. A rogue meta." She scrambled away from him, slipping on the wet ground before finding her feet. "Get away from me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the narrow alley. She didn't spare a second glance for her purse, which lay forgotten on the ground. She just ran, her footsteps splashing frantically until she disappeared into the neon-lit haze of the main street. Her parting scream, "Somebody call LCC! There's a meta!" hung in the air like a poisoned dart. Deku stood frozen, his hands still outstretched. The green lightning around him fizzled out, leaving him in the cold, dim light. Her words echoed in his head. Rogue meta. Not hero. Not villain. Something else. Something to be feared. The rain felt colder now. The warmth of his heroic conviction felt fragile, a flickering candle in a hurricane. He had saved her, but she had looked at him with the same fear a civilian would show Shigaraki. The realization was a punch to the gut, harder than any physical blow he had ever taken. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this world. A low groan brought him back to the present. One of the thugs was trying to crawl away. Deku's training kicked in. He couldn't leave them here. They needed to be apprehended, given medical attention. He took a step forward, but his foot landed on something soft and pulpy. He looked down. It was a newspaper, soaked through from lying in a gutter-fed puddle. The ink was bleeding, but the main headline was still shockingly clear, printed in a bold, severe font. LexCorp's security force maintains Metropolis grid. 5 years since the fall. Deku stared at the words, his mind struggling to process them. LexCorp? Metropolis? He knew those names. They were from the ancient pre-Quark comic books Kaminari and Ciro were obsessed with. Fictional places, fictional companies. His eyes darted to the date, printed in the top right corner. His blood ran cold. The year was more than a decade in the future from his own time. No, he whispered, his voice trembling. He knelt, his knees sinking into the filthy water, and picked up the soggy paper. His hands shook so badly the paper rattled. He scanned the other headlines, his desperation growing with every word. Bloodhaven Mayor pledges crackdown on rising vigilantism. Wayne Foundation charity gala cancelled for 5th consecutive year. Luther, the age of reckless demigods is over. Humanity is its own savior. The fall. The words from the main headline burned in his mind. 5 years since the fall. It was capitalized, like a proper noun. An event. A cataclysm. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying, sickening certainty. This wasn't just America. This wasn't a quirk accident, the crystal fracture. The alien energy. The comic book names. The woman's terror at his power. It wasn't that this world feared quirks. It was that this world had once had powers, had once had heroes, Superman, Batman, the Justice League of the old stories, and had lost them. The fall wasn't just a turn of phrase. It was a historical event. They were gone. And the world they left behind was this. A world that feared power, that distrusted heroes, that put its faith in a corporation run by a man who, in the old stories, was Superman's greatest enemy. He was not on his Earth. He was not in his time. He was somewhere else entirely. A parallel world. A future that was not his own. The strength left his legs. The newspaper slipped from his numb fingers and fell back into the puddle with a soft splash. The adrenaline that had sustained him, the heroic purpose that had driven him, all of it evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow abyss of despair. The pain returned with a vengeance. His head swam, the alley spinning around him. The sounds of the city, the distant sirens, the hum of traffic, the relentless patter of the rain, faded into a dull roar. Black spots danced in his vision. He was lost. He was alone. He was in a world that had forgotten how to hope. His knees buckled. He fell forward, his body too heavy, his spirit too crushed to hold himself up any longer. He braced for the impact with the hard, unforgiving pavement, a final surrender to the broken world he had fallen into. But the impact never came. A pair of strong, surprisingly gentle hands caught him, stopping his fall. He felt himself being eased down, his head cradled to prevent it from striking the ground. Through the fog of his fading consciousness, Deku looked up. He saw a face, etched with the deep lines of age and a sorrow so profound it seemed carved into the man's very bones. He was old, with thinning gray hair, a meticulously trimmed mustache, and eyes that were a startlingly sharp blue, filled with a weary intelligence. He was dressed in an impeccable, if slightly worn, black suit and tie, a stark absurdity in the filth of the Gotham alley. The old man looked down at him, his gaze assessing, taking in the strange, colorful costume, the green hair, the sheer, unadulterated power that radiated from him even in his weakened state. A flicker of something, recognition, memory, pain, crossed the man's face. He let out a long, tired sigh, the sound barely audible above the rain. "Oh dear," the old man murmured, his voice a low, cultured baritone, rich with a British accent that was as out of place as his suit. He adjusted his grip, preparing to lift the strange, super-powered boy. "Master Bruce," he said, more to himself than to Deku, his voice thick with a grief that felt ageless. He would have known what to do with you. The world finally went dark, and Izuku Midoriya knew no more. Consciousness returned not as a sudden jolt, but as a slow, creeping tide. The first thing Izuku Midoriya perceived was a profound stillness, a silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. It was the absolute antithesis of the chaotic battlefield he'd left behind and the grimy, rain-lashed alley he'd collapsed in. The second sensation was the air itself. It was cold, carrying the damp, mineral scent of ancient stone and deep earth. But layered beneath it was the clean, sharp smell of antiseptic and the faint, metallic tang of ozone, like the air after a thunderstorm. He was lying on something soft, a simple cot, and a rough but warm wool blanket was draped over him. His eyes fluttered open. The light was dim, coming from scattered, recessed fixtures far above, casting long, dramatic shadows that danced and stretched into an immense, cavernous darkness. The ceiling was a natural wonder of stalactites, glistening with moisture that dripped with a slow, steady, rhythmic beat into unseen pools below. Drip, drip, drip. It was the only sound, the slow, melancholic heartbeat of the cave. He was in a cave. A massive one. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize him. He pushed it down, his hero training overriding his fear. Assess. He wasn't restrained. He felt a bandage wrapped snugly around his ribs and another on his shoulder. His wounds had been cleaned and dressed with professional care. His tattered suit had been removed, and he was wearing a simple, soft gray t-shirt and loose black pants. His costume, what was left of it, was folded neatly on a metal chair beside the cot, alongside his battered utility belt and mangled iron-soled boots. He sat up slowly, his body a constellation of aches. The world didn't spin. The fog in his head had cleared. He looked around, truly taking in his surroundings. This was no ordinary cave. It was a fusion of nature and impossible technology. Against one wall stood a colossal computer, its multiple screens dark save for a single, pulsing cursor on the central monitor. A sleek, black car, long and angular like a predator, sat nearby under a heavy gray tarp, its shape a silent promise of immense power. Workbenches were laden with tools and half-finished gadgets he couldn't begin to comprehend. Glass cases, dark and unlit, lined a section of the rock wall, and then he saw him. The old man from the alley. He was standing with his back to Deku, meticulously cleaning a small piece of complex-looking electronics with a soft cloth. His posture was ramrod straight, a study in disciplined dignity. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of practice and service. "You are awake." The man spoke without turning, his British accent crisp and clear in the echoing silence. "I would advise against any sudden movements. You have 3 cracked ribs, severe bruising across your torso, and signs of extreme exhaustion. I have administered a mild painkiller, but it will not hold up against foolishness." Deku's hand instinctively went to his side, feeling the tight wrap of the bandages. His mind raced. This man had found him, brought him here, tended to his wounds. He wasn't a threat, at least, not an immediate one. Where am I?" Deku's voice was raspy. The old man finally turned. His face, under the stark light of a nearby workbench lamp, was even more deeply etched with sorrow than Deku had first realized. But his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "You are in a place that no longer has a name," he said, setting the electronic piece down. "It was once a base of operations. A sanctuary? Now, it is little more than a tomb. You may call me Alfred." "Alfred." Deku repeated the name. "Thank you for helping me. It is my nature to mend what is broken," Alfred replied, his gaze unwavering. "And you, young man, are very, very broken. The question is, are you dangerous?" The question hung in the cold air between them. It wasn't an accusation, but a simple, pragmatic inquiry. Deku felt a flicker of one for all spark in his core, a defensive instinct. He could be on his feet in a second, power coursing through him. But he looked at Alfred, at the deep-seated exhaustion in the man's eyes, and knew that wasn't the answer. Honesty was his only weapon here. "No," Deku said, his voice firm. "I'm not dangerous. I'm a hero." Alfred's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, skepticism, perhaps pity, passed through his eyes. "That is a word I have not heard spoken with such conviction in a very long time. Most who claim it these days are thugs with a flag or fools with a death wish." "Which are you?" "Neither," Deku said, swinging his legs over the side of the cot. He winced as his ribs protested, but he stood, needing to face this man on his own 2 feet. "I told you. I'm a hero. My name is Izuku Midoriya. My hero name is Deku. I come from a world where being a hero is a profession. A duty. Where people still believe in them." He began to explain, the words tumbling out in a rush of earnest confusion. He told Alfred about Japan, about UA. High school, about quirks, the biological phenomenon that granted 80% of his world's population a superpower. He described the war with the Paranormal Liberation Front, the battle with Shigaraki, the malfunctioning warp gate. He left out the deepest secrets of One for All, the vestiges and its sacred origin, but he explained his own power as a strength-enhancing quirk passed down to him. Alfred listened with unnerving stillness, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't interrupt. He simply absorbed every word, his keen eyes analyzing Deku's posture, his tone, the frantic sincerity in his expression. When Deku finished, breathless and heartsore from recounting the home he'd been torn from, the cave was silent once more, save for the steady drip, drip, drip of the water. A parallel world, Alfred stated, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. One where the fundamental concept of heroism was not extinguished. Remarkable. Extinguished? Deku latched onto the word. The newspaper I found, it mentioned the fall. It said it's been 5 years. What happened? What was the fall? A shadow passed over Alfred's face, so profound it seemed to draw the light from the room. He turned away from Deku and walked slowly toward the row of darkened glass display cases. He pressed a button on a nearby console. With a low hum, lights flickered on inside the cases, illuminating the relics within. They were memorials. In the first, suspended behind reinforced glass, was a cape. It was made of a brilliant red fabric that seemed to drink the light, adorned with a large, stylized S in yellow and red. But the cape was not pristine. It was riddled with holes, its edges frayed and scorched, a tattered flag from a lost kingdom. In the next, a pair of silver bracelets rested on a velvet cushion. They were elegant, powerful, but one of them was horribly deformed, cracked almost in two, the metal warped as if by an impossible force. Next to them, on a simple pedestal, lay a single green ring. It was dark, lifeless, its inner light completely gone, like a star that had died. Deku stared, his breath catching in his throat. He knew these symbols. Even in his world, they were legends, myths from a bygone era of fiction. Superman. Wonder Woman. Green Lantern. They were real, Deku whispered, his voice filled with a childlike awe that was immediately crushed by the grim reality of the display. Oh, they were more than real, lad, Alfred said, his voice thick with emotion. He rested a hand on the glass of Superman's display, his fingers tracing the outline of the S. They were hope, incarnate. They were the very best of us. And they were broken. He began to speak, and as he did, the story of the fall unfolded, a grim tapestry of cosmic horror and psychological warfare. It was not a villain from this world, Alfred explained, his voice a low monotone, as if reciting a memorized, painful history. It called itself the Overmind. A psychic entity from the void between galaxies, a hive consciousness of unimaginable intellect. It did not come to conquer with armies or brute force. Its methods were far more insidious. It came to prove a point, that hope is a flaw, and order, its absolute, logical order, is salvation. He paused, gesturing to Superman's tattered cape. It did not try to overpower Kal-El. It knew it couldn't. Instead, it linked him to the minds of a billion beings it had already assimilated across the cosmos. It made him feel their every moment of suffering, their despair, their extinction. It turned his greatest strength, his boundless empathy, into an instrument of unimaginable torture. He was drowned in a sea of psychic agony until his mind simply shattered. Deku felt a wave of nausea. He thought of his own desire to save everyone, to feel their pain. To have that very quality used to destroy you, it was monstrous. Alfred moved to Wonder Woman's bracelets. Princess Diana was the greatest warrior I have ever known, second to none in combat. The Overmind did not face her on a battlefield. It created one in her mind. It used its telepathic power to conjure phantoms of her fallen Amazon sisters, her mother, Steve Trevor. It made her believe she was defending Themyscira from an invasion, forcing her to fight and defeat the specters of everyone she had ever loved, again and again, until her spirit, the indomitable spirit of a goddess, broke under the weight of manufactured grief. His voice grew softer, more pained, as he stopped before an empty display case. It was larger than the others, shrouded in shadow. There was no plaque, no relic. Just an empty space. And then there was him, Alfred whispered, not needing to say the name. Batman. The master of strategy. The man who planned for every contingency. The Overmind didn't need to break his body. It simply showed him that his mind, his greatest weapon, was a child's toy. It anticipated his every move, his every strategy, his every thought before he even had it. It laid his soul bare and showed him the futility of his struggle. It proved to him, with cold, irrefutable logic, that he could not win, that his entire life's mission was a statistical error, destined for failure. In the end, he was not defeated. He was solved. Deku felt tears welling in his eyes. He thought of his own analytical mind, the notebooks filled with observations, the strategies he'd developed by watching his friends and enemies. To have that turned against you, to be so completely and utterly outthought. While it was dismantling them from the inside, Alfred continued, his voice regaining its hard edge, it was also dismantling their legacy. It orchestrated disasters, using its subtle influence to make it appear as though the League's powers were going haywire. A stray blast from a Green Lantern, a tremor from one of Superman's landings that destabilized the fault line, a misstep by the Flash that caused a city-wide power surge. Small incidents, amplified by a global media campaign of fear and misinformation it manipulated from the shadows. It didn't just kill the heroes. It murdered the world's faith in them. By the time of the final battle, most of the planet saw the Justice League not as saviors, but as reckless, dangerous demigods whose hubris had finally come to collect its due. The final battle, Alfred explained, was a slaughter. A psychologically broken league, fighting without the support of the world they swore to protect, faced the Overmind's true, physical manifestation. They fought, and they fell. One by one, they vanished or were confirmed dead. And when the dust settled, the world was silent. The gods were gone. Into that vacuum of power and hope stepped Lex Luthor. He had always warned of the dangers of relying on alien power, Alfred said with a sneer of contempt. He emerged as a prophet. He offered stability, order, safety, all under the technological umbrella of his corporation. Luthor Corp didn't save the world from the Overmind. He simply swept in and claimed the throne after the war was already lost. He provides power, security, and a simple narrative. Humanity is its own savior, and the age of heroes was a mistake we will not repeat. The people, terrified and betrayed, believed him. The story ended. The cave was silent again, the weight of 5 years of despair pressing down on them. Deku's mind reeled, trying to process the sheer, calculated cruelty of it all. This wasn't a villain like All for One, who sought power for its own sake. The Overmind had waged a war on the very concept of heroism. He looked at the empty display case, the one for Batman, and then at Alfred, whose stoic facade was finally cracking, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. In that moment, Deku understood. Alfred hadn't just been their ally. He was their friend. Their family. He had lost everyone. Deku's own trauma, his own fear, his own sense of being lost, was suddenly dwarfed by the sheer scale of the tragedy that had befallen this world. He thought of his own society's struggles, the public's waning faith after Kamino, the way heroes were being criticized and questioned. This world was a dark mirror, a vision of what his own home could become if hope was truly lost. And in that dark mirror, his purpose became terrifyingly clear. He clenched his fists, the knuckles white. The tears in his eyes were no longer for himself, but for the fallen League, for Alfred, for this entire broken world. All Might. Deku's voice was a choked whisper, but it cut through the silence. Alfred looked at him, his expression questioning. My mentor, Deku clarified, his voice growing stronger, imbued with a fire that came from the very core of his being. He was our symbol of peace. He was one man, but he was so bright, so unwavering, that his presence alone kept the darkness at bay. He showed us that one person's hope, one person's refusal to give up, could change the world. He got old, he got hurt, he lost his power, but his lesson, his spirit, that can't be extinguished. He took a step forward, his eyes burning with an intensity that made Alfred take an involuntary step back. It was a look he had seen before, in the eyes of a boy who'd lost his parents in an alley, in the eyes of an alien who had adopted a planet as his own. It was the fire of impossible, unreasonable, magnificent resolve. This overmind, it thinks it won because it proved hope was illogical, Deku said, his voice ringing with a conviction that defied the cold logic of the cave. But hope isn't logical. It's not about statistics or probabilities. It's a choice. It's the choice to stand up when everyone else stays down. It's the choice to save someone, even when you're scared, even when you're hurt. He gestured wildly at the silent memorials, at the oppressive darkness of the cave. They may be gone. But their choice, what they stood for, that can't die unless everyone lets it. I won't let it. He looked Alfred directly in the eye, and the old butler saw not a lost boy, but a living, breathing symbol. A world without hope, Deku declared, the tears now streaming freely down his face, hot and defiant, is one I can't stand by and watch. I don't know how. I don't know if I can even survive here, but I will not let this despair be the end of the story. I will save them. I will remind them. For the first time in 5 years, a genuine, unforced emotion broke through Alfred Pennyworth's carefully constructed wall of grief. He stared at this impossible child from another universe, who was echoing the very creed upon which the Justice League was founded. He was naive. He was reckless. He was probably going to get himself killed. He was magnificent. A dry, rusty sound escaped Alfred's throat. It took him a moment to realize he was chuckling. It was a hollow, broken sound, but it was a chuckle nonetheless. You silly, extraordinary boy, he said, shaking his head as he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He would have liked you. In his own grim, monosyllabic way, Alfred walked over to the main console of the giant computer. He tapped a few keys, and the massive screen flickered to life, bathing that section of the cave in a cool, blue light. If you are to be this world's new fool, you will not do so being an ignorant one. The screen filled with files, images, schematics. This is the back computer. It contains every piece of information Master Bruce ever gathered on his allies and enemies, their strengths, their weaknesses, their histories. It is a ghost library. Read it. Study it. Understand the legacy you are so determined to champion. He then gestured to a workshop area, cleaner than the rest. Over there are the tools to repair your equipment. The suit's material is unfamiliar, but its design is sound. The support gear, clever. Master Bruce would have appreciated the blend of utility and personal style. Deku walked toward the console, his eyes wide with wonder. The sheer volume of information was staggering. Files on metahumans, advanced science, global criminal organizations. It was everything he ever dreamed of and more. It was the ultimate hero notebook. Alfred, why? Deku asked, his voice soft. Why are you helping me? Alfred looked from the glowing screen to the shadowed memorials, and finally back to the boy silhouetted before them. For 5 years, this place has been a mausoleum, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I have maintained it as a tribute to a failed idea. I have polished the memories of gods and watched the world grow colder. But you are not a memory. You are not a ghost. You are an idea with a pulse. He picked up the neatly folded, tattered remains of Deku's costume and handed it to him. You have reminded an old man that a light, no matter how small, is still a light, Alfred said. Now get to work, Master Midoriya. It would seem you have a world to save. Deku took his costume, the worn fabric feeling both familiar and new in his hands. He stood there, alone, injured teenager in the secret heart of a fallen legend, the weight of a world on his shoulders. He looked at the files of Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, giants he could never hope to replace. The task was impossible. The odds were insurmountable. He felt a familiar, exhilarating fire ignite in his chest. It was perfect. He turned to the computer, his mind already alight with analysis and purpose. He had work to do. 2 weeks, 14 days in the cold, echoing heart of a legend. For Izuku Midoriya, the Batcave had become a strange fusion of a monastery, a university, and a rehabilitation center. The rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water from the stalactites was the only clock he knew, each drop measuring out a moment of his strange, untethered existence. His days were a disciplined cycle of recovery and preparation, orchestrated by the quiet, ever-watchful presence of Alfred Pennyworth. Mornings were for physical conditioning, He would run circuits around the cave's perimeter, the green lightning of one for all crackling softly at 5% as he pushed his healing body. Alfred, ever the pragmatist, would follow his progress on a medical monitor, offering dry commentary like, "While I appreciate the enthusiasm, Master Izuku, kindly try not to reopen the fissure in your 9th rib. I just sealed it." Afternoons were for study. He would sit for hours before the glowing monolith of the Bat computer, a fresh notebook, a gift from Alfred, bound in simple black leather, open beside him. He devoured the information with a feverish intensity that unnerved even the stoic butler. He was not just reading, he was inhaling a legacy. He mapped the complex web of Gotham's criminal underworld, his pencil scratching furiously as he detailed the territories, hierarchies, and known associates of figures like Oswald Cobblepot, the Penguin, whose influence was a blight on the city's commerce. He studied the psychological profiles of fallen heroes and villains, his own analytical mind finding a grim kinship with Batman's meticulous, almost paranoid, attention to detail. He prepared for everything, Deku had murmured one afternoon, staring at a file labeled Contingency, Zeta, which detailed a plan to neutralize a rogue Justice League. He prepared for everything but the enemy he could not punch, nor outthink, Alfred had replied softly from a nearby console, his voice heavy with the memory. He prepared for the body, but the overmind attacked the soul. Evenings were for repair. His hero costume was a puzzle of torn fabric and shattered dreams. Using the cave's advanced fabrication tools, he painstakingly mended it. He couldn't replicate the high-tensile material from his own world, so he patched the rips with a matte black, carbon fiber-laced polymer he found in the workshop. It was meant for reinforcing armor plating, and it gave his familiar green suit a darker, more somber appearance. His mask, the one that evoked All Might's smile, was repaired, but the grin seemed less certain now. His iconic bunny ears, however, remained. They were a piece of his mother's design, a piece of him, and he refused to let this dark world take that away. Finally, after 2 weeks, the day came. His ribs were a dull ache instead of a sharp stab. His suit, a patchwork of 2 worlds, felt strong again. He had absorbed a fraction of the Bat computer's knowledge, enough to know that charging in blindly was a death sentence. He stood before Alfred, fully suited up. The green was darker, the new black patches absorbing the dim cave light. He looked less like a sunny symbol of peace and more like a vigilante born of the shadows he now inhabited. "I'm ready," Deku said, his voice echoing with a resolve that seemed to push back against the oppressive darkness of the cave. Alfred stood by the dormant Batmobile, a lint-free cloth in his hand, his expression a mixture of pride and profound trepidation. "Ready, Master Izuku? Or simply impatient?" "Both," Deku admitted. "But people are suffering out there. I can see it in the data. Extortion, violence, the crime rate in the lower districts is appalling." "It always has been," Alfred finished. "LexCorp's security forces, the LCC, maintain order in the affluent sectors and on the main thoroughfares. They protect assets, not people. The rest of the city is left to the wolves." He sighed, placing the cloth down. "You have the lay of the land. You understand the factions. But data is not the same as the street. Be cautious. Your power is a beacon. In a world of darkness, a beacon draws moths, but it also draws predators." "I'll be careful," Deku promised. "Observe first. Act only when necessary. Stay out of sight." Alfred nodded, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "You are learning. Go, then. And for heaven's sake, do try to return in one piece. I am far too old to be patching up demigods on a nightly basis." With a final nod, Deku turned toward a secondary exit, a vertical shaft that led to a disguised opening in a nearby, derelict building. He took a breath, channeling a minuscule amount of One for All. "Float," he whispered. Nana Shimura's quirk answered, and he rose silently into the darkness, a green and black wraith ascending from the ghost's tomb. The air on the Gotham rooftops was a physical assault. It was a cold, damp cocktail of industrial smog, exhaust fumes, and the pervasive, underlying stench of urban decay. Neon signs from the streets below cast a lurid, sickly glow on the low-hanging clouds, painting the sky in shades of blood red and chemical green. It was a city drowning in its own shadow. Deku moved like a phantom, a discipline learned from watching countless hours of Batman's patrol footage. He kept to the highest points, using float and short, controlled bursts to clear wide gaps between buildings, his movements nearly silent. His enhanced senses were on high alert, cataloging the cacophony of the city, the distant, discordant wail of sirens, the rumble of the elevated train, the angry shouts from a bar fight 3 stories below. His eyes scanned the streets, cross-referencing the visual data with the maps in his head. He saw the subtle signs of Penguin's territory, small, stylized umbrella symbols spray-painted on walls, doormen outside exclusive clubs wearing monocles as a sign of allegiance. He saw areas controlled by a newer player, Black Mask, marked by crude, spray-painted skull icons. The city was a chessboard, and he was an unknown piece, dropped into the middle of the game. His danger sense, the quirk from the fourth user, Haiku Shinomori, had been a low, constant hum since he'd arrived in this world. The general despair and latent violence of Gotham kept it perpetually on edge. But as he moved toward the central transit district, the hum began to spike, not with the sharp sting of imminent physical threat, but with a strange, spreading wave of unease. It was like sensing a psychic ripple, a wave of pure, unadulterated panic. He perched on the head of a stone gargoyle overlooking the entrance to the historic Tricorner station. From his vantage point he saw it. People were stumbling out of the grand archways, not in a rush, but in a dissociated daze. Some were weeping uncontrollably. Others were screaming at phantoms only they could see. A man in a business suit was swatting at his own body, shrieking about insects crawling under his skin. A mother was clutching her child, her eyes wide with a terror that had no visible source. It wasn't a riot. It was a mass hallucination. Toxin, Deku breathed, the word cold in his throat. He'd cross-referenced this signature with the Batcomputer's files. There was only one villain in Gotham who weaponized fear on this scale: Jonathan Crane. The Scarecrow. His mind raced. Scarecrow's toxin was typically dispersed via gas. The victims were coming out of the station. That meant the source was inside. He had to get in, neutralize the source, and deal with the perpetrator, all while avoiding the toxin himself. His eyes scanned the station's magnificent but decaying facade. Grand, arched windows lined the upper levels, most of them grimy and dark. A large, ornate clock face, its hands frozen at 2:45, sat above the main entrance. The station's ventilation system intakes were likely on the roof. That was the probable delivery method. He didn't hesitate. Using FA gene to build kinetic energy, he launched himself into the air, activating float to sustain his arc. He soared over the panicked crowd, a fleeting shadow against the toxic sky, and landed silently on the station's copper roof. He was right. For large, industrial-grade ventilation units were chugging away, and hooked up to each one was a jury-rigged system of canisters and hoses. A faint, yellowish vapor, smelling of bitter almonds and freshly turned earth, was being pumped directly into the building. Standing guard were half a dozen men dressed in tattered burlap and wearing crude, modified gas masks that gave them an insected appearance. They carried heavy wrenches and pipes, their posture zealous. The unfeared, Deku muttered, recalling the file. Crane's cult-like followers, individuals so traumatized by life they sought out his toxin, believing it burned away all lesser fears, leaving only a pure, divine terror in its wake. He couldn't afford a prolonged fight. He needed to be a whirlwind. He dropped from the rooftop ledge into their midst. He was a whisper, and then a storm. 5% Detroit smash. His first punch wasn't a punch at all. It was a focused blast of air pressure aimed at the first thug's chest. The man was thrown back into 2 of his companions, sending them down in a heap. Black whip erupted from Deku's arms, 2 tendrils lashing out. One wrapped around the ankle of a 4th thug, yanking him off his feet. The other snatched a pipe from a 5th man's hand before it could come crashing down on his head. He moved between them, a blur of controlled chaos. He wasn't the brawler he used to be. Every movement was precise, economical. A tap to a pressure point in the neck learned from a diagram in the back computer. A leg sweep taught by Gran Torino. A quick, disarming maneuver that sent a wrench spinning away. In under 10 seconds, all 6 of the unfeared were on the ground, groaning and incapacitated. He turned his attention to the canisters, ready to use Black Whip to disconnect the hoses. But his danger sense screamed, a needle-sharp spike of warning aimed directly at his face. He reacted on pure instinct, throwing himself to the side. It was too late. One of the incapacitated thugs, his eyes burning with mad devotion behind his mask, had activated a small, hidden device. A tiny canister on his belt hissed, releasing a concentrated, almost invisible jet of aerosolized liquid. Deku felt a fine, cold mist on his cheek. He held his breath, but he knew it was futile. It was a contact agent, absorbed through the skin. For a moment, nothing happened. He stood there, his heart hammering in his chest. Then, the world began to melt. The edges of his vision softened and warped, the hard lines of the ventilation units bending like wax. The distant city lights smeared into distorted streaks of color. The smell of bitter almonds intensified, filling his senses, overwhelming and cloying. No, he grunted, shaking his head, trying to fight it. But the toxin was already in his bloodstream, a poison not for the body, but for the mind. It bypassed his rational thoughts and went straight for the raw, primal fears buried in his subconscious. The first vision struck him like a physical blow. The rooftop faded away, replaced by the familiar, cherry blossom-lined entrance of Yue High. But the blossoms were black, and they fell like ash. Standing there were his friends. Achiko Uraraka, her usual warm smile gone, her face pale and accusing. Tenya Ida, his glasses cracked, his posture rigid with condemnation. Shoto Todoroki, his face a mask of cold disappointment. You left us, Deku, Uraraka's voice whispered, though her lips didn't move. It was a voice inside his head. The fight was here. Your duty was here. You ran away, Ida's voice added, sharp and judgmental. A true hero does not abandon his comrades. You are a coward. We needed you, Todoroki's voice finished, the simple words colder and more cutting than any ice. And you were gone. Their forms began to decay before his eyes, their skin turning gray and sloughing off, their eyes sinking into their skulls. They were the ghosts of his greatest guilt, that in being thrown into this world, he had abandoned his own. No. I didn't. I couldn't, he stammered, stumbling backward, his hands outstretched. The vision shattered, and a new one, infinitely more cruel, took its place. He was in a dark, sterile hospital room. The steady beeping of a heart monitor was the only sound, and in the bed, impossibly thin, was Toshinori Yagi. Not All Might, the towering symbol of peace, but the skeletal, broken man he truly was. He coughed, a racking, wet sound, and a fleck of blood appeared on his lips. He looked at Deku, and there was no anger in his eyes. Only a vast, bottomless ocean of disappointment. I made a mistake, my boy, Toshinori's voice echoed in his skull, weak and full of regret. I thought you had the heart of a true hero. The will to save everyone. But one for all requires more than just heart. It requires presence. He gestured with a frail hand to the window, where the dark, menacing skyline of Gotham loomed. You couldn't even save your own world from falling into chaos. How can you possibly hope to save this one? The burden, it was too great for you. I chose wrong. The words were a stake through Deku's heart. It was his deepest, most secret fear given voice. That he was unworthy. That he was a failure who was letting down the man who had given him everything. No. All Might, please. He begged, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the Gotham grime. The toxin wasn't finished. It saved its most terrifying assault for last. The hospital room dissolved into a swirling vortex of green and black energy. He was floating in the void of the vestige world within one for all. But it was wrong. Corrupted. The faces of the past users, Daigoro Banjo, and Nana Shimura, Haikyuu Shinomori, swirled around him, their features twisted into monstrous parodies. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent red light. An unworthy vessel, the chorus of their voices thundered in his mind. A weak link in the chain, Nana Shimura's corrupted form sneered, her kind face now a mask of contempt. The quirk is wasted on you, Daigoro Banjo roared, his lariat form appearing warped and sinister. You disgrace us all. The raw power of One for All began to feel alien inside him, a burning, hostile force trying to tear itself free. He felt the vestiges reaching for it, trying to reclaim the sacred torch from his undeserving hands. This was the ultimate terror, not just failing his mission, but losing the very part of himself that made him a hero. He was about to be unmade. He screamed, a raw, desperate sound of a soul being torn apart. He was on his knees, clutching his head, completely lost in the nightmare. The world was ending, his spirit was breaking, and the laughter of the scarecrow, faint and distant in the real world, was the soundtrack to his damnation. He was about to give in, to let the despair consume him. And then, a different voice cut through the cacophony. It was not part of the illusion. It was real, a spark of warmth in the psychic maelstrom. It is a lie, ninth. The voice was Nana Shimura's, but it was her true voice, echoing from the genuine vestige core. It was firm, kind, and incandescent with heroic will. The toxin is not just attacking your mind, it's attacking the quirk. It's trying to turn our connection against you. Do not listen. Remember who you are. Another voice joined hers, gruff and impatient. Daigoro Banjo. Get up, kid! We've faced down all for one for a century. We're not about to be beaten by some quack with a chemistry set. Fight back. Their voices were an anchor in the storm. They were with him. They hadn't abandoned him. The illusion flickered, its power momentarily weakened. Fight back. How? How do you fight your own fear? And then, another memory surfaced. All Might, standing on a beach at sunrise, his voice booming. It's not about being fearless, my boy. It's about inspiring others to feel safe, even when you're terrified yourself. The toxin fed on despair. On fear. It was a psychic parasite. Deku realized he couldn't erase the fear. It was too strong, too primal. But he could fight it with something stronger. He closed his eyes, shutting out the horrifying visions. Instead of focusing on his failures, he forced himself to focus on his purpose. He pictured the faces of the family he'd saved in his own world, just before being pulled away. He pictured Alfred's sad, hopeful eyes. He pictured the terrified face of the woman in the alley, a face he was determined to one day turn to a smile. He pictured the children in the station below, cowering in fear. He wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for them. That was the core of his being. Not the power, not the legacy, but the simple, unshakable, illogical desire to save others. Hope. He weaponized it. He focused on that feeling, that burning conviction, and used it as a shield. The monstrous faces of the vestiges recoiled from the pure, brilliant light of his resolve. The voice of the disappointed All Might faded into a pathetic whisper. He opened his eyes. The world was still warped, but he could see through the illusion. He was still on the rooftop. The disconnected thugs were still groaning on the ground. The toxin was still pumping into the station. He had to end this. Now, he couldn't fight on the ground. The gas was too thick. He looked up. Thank you, Nana, he whispered. He pushed off the roof, activating float. He rose into the air, ascending through the layers of yellowish gas until he was above it, breathing the cold, clean air. Below him, the station roof was a stage set for a horror show. He needed to clear the toxin, not just from the roof, but from inside the station. He couldn't use a full power smash. It would bring the whole building down. He needed precision. He needed control. He extended his right hand, splayed his fingers, and drew on the power of one for all, channeling it not into his fist, but into a single finger. Delaware smash! A cannon of compressed air erupted from his fingertip. It wasn't a destructive blast, but a focused, controlled gale. He aimed it at the largest ventilation unit, and the airwave struck the yellowish cloud, instantly dispersing a huge section of it. The toxin, ripped from its concentrated form, began to dissipate harmlessly into the upper atmosphere. He did it again. And again. He became a human turret, suspended in the air, firing precise blasts of wind. Flick. 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 Each flick of his fingers sent a shockwave that cleared another section of the roof, another section of the station's upper levels as the clean air was forced through the vents. It was a brilliant, improvised solution, a perfect marriage of power and intelligence. The air on the roof was clearing. He could see the main culprit now. Jonathan Crane, the Scarecrow, wasn't on the roof. He was in a small, glass-walled security office overlooking the station's main concourse, watching his work with the dispassionate air of a scientist observing an experiment. Deku dropped from the air, landing silently on the ground outside the office. He didn't bother with the door. F.A. Gene. Black Whip? He built up kinetic energy and launched himself forward. A tendril of Black Whip shot out, shattering the reinforced glass. He was through the opening before the shards even hit the floor. Scarecrow spun around, startled. He was tall and gaunt, his face hidden behind a horrifyingly detailed burlap mask with stitched-on leather patches and a built-in respirator. He held a syringe claw, its needle dripping with a viscous fluid. Another one? Crane's voice was distorted by his mask, raspy and academic. A new bat in the belfry? Your fear smells exquisite. So much guilt. So much imposter syndrome. A truly sublime vintage. He lunged with the syringe claw. Deku sidestepped with ease, the toxin's effects now just a dizzying afterimage. He chopped down on Crane's wrist, forcing him to drop the weapon. It's not about. The morning after the Scarecrow incident, the Batcave was still. A fragile sense of victory hung in the cold, damp air, as tentative as a spider's thread. Izuku Midoriya, his ribs taped securely beneath a fresh t-shirt, sat at a workbench, meticulously cleaning the grime of Gotham from the armored plates of his gloves. His hands moved with a practiced focus, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the events on the station rooftop, the horrifying phantoms conjured by Crane's toxin. You are quiet, Master Izuku, Alfred's voice observed from across the cavern. The old butler was at the main console of the Bat computer, a steaming mug of tea resting beside his keyboard as he scanned through early morning news feeds. A penny for your thoughts, though I suspect they are worth considerably more. Deku looked up, setting the glove down. I was just thinking, we stopped him. We saved all those people in the station. But on my way back, I passed through the Narrows, and the fear was still there, not the toxin. Just the normal kind. People looking over their shoulders, families barricading their doors. It feels like I just scooped a single cup of water out of an ocean. Alfred turned in his chair, his expression softening with a familiar, weary empathy. That, I'm afraid, is the nature of Gotham. Master Bruce fought that same ocean for 20 years. He learned that you do not drain it. You simply build levees, one soul at a time. Your actions last night were not insignificant. You prevented a massacre and captured a dangerous predator. In this city, that is a resounding victory. He would have approved of your methods, the non-lethal efficiency, the creative use of air pressure to disperse the toxin, though he would have undoubtedly critiqued your direct exposure to the contact agent. A small smile touched Deku's lips. I'm still working on the think before you leap part. A lifelong project for many, Alfred said dryly. His eyes returned to the screen, and the faint smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid tension. His posture straightened. His fingers, which had been resting on his mug, now hovered over the keyboard. Alfred? What is it? Deku asked, his hero's intuition sensing the shift in the atmosphere. It has begun, Alfred said, his voice low and grave. The world has noticed the ripple you created. And the shark has come to investigate. He tapped a key, and the main, colossal screen of the Bat computer flickered to life, switching from lines of code to a live news broadcast. The logo, a stylized globe held within a monolithic L, was instantly recognizable to Deku from the newspaper he'd found. LexCorp Global Media. The image resolved to a press room, a stark contrast to the gothic gloom of the Batcave. It was a space of gleaming white walls, brushed chrome, and cool blue light. It was sterile, powerful, and utterly devoid of shadow. At the center of it all, standing behind a sleek podium, was a man who radiated an almost terrifying aura of confidence. He was handsome in a severe, sculpted way, with a clean-shaven head that seemed more a statement of power than a result of nature. His suit was a masterpiece of tailoring, a deep charcoal gray that cost more than the average person's car. But it was his eyes that held Deku's attention. They were a brilliant, piercing shade of green, filled with an intelligence so sharp and cold it was almost reptilian. He looked directly into the camera, and for a moment, Deku felt as if the man were staring right at him, through the screen, through the miles of rock, directly into the cave. This was Lex Luthor. Good morning, Luthor began, his voice a smooth, calming baritone that commanded immediate attention. He offered the camera a thin, reassuring smile. I'm speaking to you today from LexCorp Tower in Metropolis to address the events that transpired last night in Gotham City. He paused, letting the weight of his presence settle. I know many of you are frightened. Reports of a mass panic at Tricorner Station, instigated by the escaped Arkham inmate Jonathan Crane, have understandably shaken a city already on edge. First, let me assure you, Crane is now in a secure LCC holding facility. The situation is under control. He sounded like a president addressing his nation after a disaster. Calm. In control. Paternal. But the capture of Crane, Luthor continued, his expression shifting to one of grave concern, is not the most significant part of this story. For last night, Gotham was host to another, far more unpredictable threat. A new, unregistered metahuman. On the massive screen behind Luthor, an image appeared. It was grainy, shaky footage clearly taken from a bystander's phone. It showed Deku, a green and black blur, dispatching Scarecrow's thugs on the station roof. The speed was inhuman, the movements unnervingly fluid. We have confirmed that this entity, Luthor said, his choice of words deliberate and dehumanizing, was responsible for incapacitating Crane's followers. An act which, on the surface, may appear heroic. He held up a hand. But we, as a global society, made a vow 5 years ago. We swore we would never again place our safety in the hands of unaccountable, superpowered beings who operate outside the law. We swore we would never again tolerate the chaos and destruction that follows in their wake. The footage behind him changed. It was now a new angle, one Deku didn't recognize. It must have been from a security camera he'd missed. It showed him, suspended in the air, firing his Delaware smash. But the video was expertly, maliciously edited. The focus wasn't on the dissipating fear toxin. It was on the sheer power of the blast. The video was slowed down, a red circle highlighting the concussive force. They had added sound effects, the roar of an explosion, the screech of stressed metal. They cut to a different shot, a piece of unrelated architecture with a large crack in it, implying his attack had caused structural damage. This is the power this entity unleashed in a populated civilian area, Luthor's voice overstated, cold, and factual. Uncontrolled. Unmeasured. A power capable of leveling city blocks, used mere feet above the heads of hundreds of terrified citizens. Deku shot to his feet. No! That's not what happened. I was dispersing the gas. I was careful. Alfred placed a hand on his shoulder. Quiet, lad. Listen. This is the weapon he is using. The footage changed again. It showed Deku's fight with Nightwing, another piece of footage Deku had no idea existed. It was cut to make Nightwing look like an LCC officer trying to apprehend him. It showed Deku's use of Black Whip, the dark tendrils lashing out. The footage was freeze-framed on the tendrils, zoomed in, their alien, organic movement made to look monstrous. This entity possesses multiple, uncatalogued abilities, Luthor continued, his voice resonating with grim authority. It displays superhuman strength, speed, flight, and this, disturbing biogenesis. Abilities that mirror the chaotic and dangerous powers of the so-called Justice League. That was the master stroke. He was tying Deku directly to the trauma of the fall. 5 years ago, Luthor said, his voice dropping, taking on a tone of shared grief, we watched as demigods, drunk on their own power and hubris, brought our world to the brink. They promised us protection, and instead delivered an apocalypse. We learned a harsh lesson, that absolute power, unchecked, does not corrupt. It simply reveals the inherent flaw in anything that is not human. He leaned forward, his green eyes boring into the camera lens. Humanity is its own savior. Through logic, through innovation, through cooperation, we have rebuilt. We have created a safer, more stable world under the protection of LexCorp's global security network. An order built by human hands for human good. This Deku, as some on the street have begun to call him, Luthor said the name with a palpable sneer, is a regression. A throwback to an age of chaos we have evolved past. He is not a hero. He is a symptom of the disease we have fought so hard to cure. He is a spark, and we all know what sparks can do in a powder keg. The broadcast concluded with a final, chillingly reasonable directive. I am not issuing a bounty. We are not vigilantes. We are a society of laws. But I am asking every citizen, for your own safety, to be vigilant. If you see this entity, do not approach. Do not engage. Report the sighting immediately to your nearest LCC patrol or through the LexCorp SecureNet app. Let us handle this. Let us keep you safe. The screen went dark, but Luther's face, a mask of charismatic, benevolent control, remained burned into Deku's mind. The broadcast had been a work of genius, a masterpiece of propaganda. In the space of 5 minutes, Lex Luthor had taken Deku's heroic act and twisted it into a terrifying omen. He hadn't declared him a villain. He had declared him a problem. A dangerous, obsolete idea, and in this cynical world, that was so much worse. He's lying, Deku whispered, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. One for all fizzled around him, a storm of frustrated, impotent green energy. Every word, it's a lie. I saved people. Why would he do this? Because you represent the one thing he cannot control, Master Izuku, Alfred said, his voice grim as he turned from the console. Hope. Luther's power is built upon a foundation of fear and despair. He is the sole provider of security in a world that believes it is under constant threat. He sells order. You, on the other hand, are giving it away for free. You threaten his narrative, his control, and by extension, his entire empire. So what do I do? Deku asked, his voice desperate. Go out there? Fight LSEC? Prove him right? Absolutely not, Alfred stated firmly. That is the trap he has set for you. You cannot punch your way out of a narrative, my boy. Luther controls the media. He controls the global communications network. He has the ear of every government. If you fight his forces, you are a violent metahuman. If you hide, you are a lurking threat. He has framed the debate, and in doing so, he has already won the first battle. Deku sank onto the edge of the cot, his head in his hands. The sheer, suffocating scale of the problem was crushing him. All his power, all his training, felt useless against this. Then it's over. I can't be a hero here. Every time I save someone, he'll just twist it until they're more afraid of me than the person I saved them from. No, Alfred said, his voice cutting through Deku's despair. It means you must change your strategy. You cannot be a lone symbol like All Might was. Not in this world. A single light is too easily snuffed out. You need more lights. You need allies. He walked over to the Bat computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The world did not entirely surrender after the fall. Many of those with abilities, heroes and villains alike, were killed or captured. But some just disappeared. They went off the grid, disillusioned, heartbroken, wanting only to be left alone. A file appeared on the screen. It was a picture of a woman with stunningly blue eyes and dark, raven hair. She was on a stage, dressed in a magician's classic tuxedo, complete with a top hat and fishnet stockings. She was smiling, but there was a sharp intelligence, a hint of wild power, in her gaze. Name Zatanna Zatara. Alias None. Abilities Homo Magi. Master-level magical adept. Spoken incantation, Logomancy. Affiliation, Justice League, provisional member. Status, inactive. Presumed living. Zatanna Zatara, Alfred said softly. Her father, Giovanni Zatara, was one of the most powerful sorcerers of his age and a founding member of the League's magical contingent. He taught Master Bruce the art of escape, a skill that saved his life more than once. Giovanni died during the fall, sacrificing himself to sever a magical anchor the Overmind had tethered to the Earth's ley lines. Zatanna was there. She saw it happen. He pulled up another document. A transcript of her last known communication. It's all just tricks. Words and smoke. It couldn't save him. It can't save anyone. She lost her father, and in the process she lost her faith, Alfred concluded. She believes magic, the very core of her being, is a useless parlor trick against the true horrors of the universe. Our last intelligence placed her in New Orleans, far from the centers of power, living under a new name. Deku looked at the picture, at the vibrant, powerful woman on the stage, and then at the transcript, at the broken words of a grieving daughter. He saw the same despair he felt now, the same sense of powerlessness. You want me to find her? Deku asked. And what? Ask her to put the costume back on. She'll say no, probably, Alfred agreed. But you will not be asking her to join a new Justice League. You will not be asking her to fight Lex Luthor. You will go to her, and you will show her the truth you showed me, that hope is not a strategy, but a spirit. That one light is weak, but two can begin to push back the darkness. He looked at Deku, his eyes piercing. Luthor has declared you a monster. You cannot tell the world he is wrong. You must show them. And you cannot do that alone. Deku stood up, the despair in his heart being replaced by a familiar, stubborn fire. The plan was insane. He, a stranger from another dimension, was going to try and recruit a disillusioned master magician to fight a shadow war against the most powerful man on the planet. It was the most heroic thing he could think of. Okay, he said, his voice steady. New Orleans. How do I get there? Alfred allowed himself another of his rare, faint smiles. The same way the previous tenant of this cave did. Discreetly. New Orleans was a city of beautiful decay. Where Gotham was a monument to Gothic despair, the French Quarter was a celebration of life persisting in the face of entropy. The air was thick and humid, a stark contrast to Gotham's biting cold, and it carried a rich gumbo of smells, sweet beignet and bitter chicory from the Café du Monde, the earthy scent of the Mississippi River, the faint, floral perfume of jasmine climbing up wrought iron balconies. A lone saxophone wailed a bluesy, mournful tune from a street corner, the notes hanging in the air like threads of gold. Deku, dressed in a simple dark hoodie and jeans provided by Alfred, kept his head down, a walking ghost in the vibrant crowd. Alfred had arranged transport via a network of old, untraceable suborbital transit points Batman had used for global travel, dropping him in the Louisiana bayou just after dawn. The walk into the city had been surreal, moving from the primal swamp to the bustling streets. He found the address Alfred had given him tucked away on a quieter side street, away from the drunken reverie of Bourbon Street. The sign above the door was hand-painted, the letters elegant but faded, Zatara's Curios Tomes. The shop window was cluttered with dusty old books, strange-looking crystals, and tarot decks. It looked less like a magical sanctum and more like a place where forgotten things went to die. He pushed the door open, a small bell chiming his arrival. The inside smelled of old paper, lavender, and something else, something that reminded him of ozone, a faint, lingering scent of static electricity. The shop was a labyrinth of towering bookshelves, crammed with volumes from floor to ceiling. Behind a wooden counter, a woman was performing a simple card trick for a middle-aged tourist couple. She fanned the deck with an expert flourish, her hands moving with a dancer's grace. "Is this your card?" she asked, her voice smooth and playful as she produced the king of spades from behind the man's ear. The couple gasped in delight. Deku watched her, his heart pounding. It was her. Her hair was the same raven black, though it was tied back in a messy bun now. Her eyes were the same piercing blue, though they seemed clouded with a weariness that the stage photo hadn't shown. She was dressed in simple jeans and a worn t-shirt for a local band. The dazzling magician was gone, replaced by a tired bookseller. After the tourists paid for a small crystal and left, the shop fell silent. Zatanna began tidying the counter, her back to him, clearly hoping he would browse and leave. He walked up to the counter. "I'm looking for Zatanna Zatara," he said, his voice quiet but clear. She didn't look up, her hands continuing to straighten a pile of paperbacks. "Never heard of her," she said, her tone flat and dismissive. "This is a bookstore, not a missing persons bureau. Your father was Giovanni Zatara," Deku pressed gently. "He was a great hero. He fought alongside the Justice League." Her hands stopped moving. She went utterly still for a moment before she slowly turned to face him. Her eyes, no longer weary, were now chips of ice. "I don't know who you are or what game you're playing," she said, her voice dangerously low. "But you have 2 seconds to get out of my shop before I call the police. And unlike in Gotham, the police here still show up." "My name is Izuka Midoriya," he said, holding his ground. "I'm not here to play games. I'm here because I need your help. The world needs your help." Zatanna let out a short, bitter laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of humor. The world? The world made its choice. It chose Lex Luthor. It chose safety over freedom. It chose order over heroes. She practically spat the last word. There's nothing to help. That's not true, Deku insisted, his voice rising with passion. There are people who are afraid, people who Luther's order doesn't protect. There are monsters in the dark, and people like you, people with the power to fight them, are hiding in bookstores pretending it's not your problem. Her eyes flashed with anger. Hiding? Let me tell you about not hiding. My father stood on a battlefield of pure magic, staring down a cosmic god. He spoke his spells, the most powerful words in our lexicon, words that could rewrite reality. And you know what they did? They fizzled out like cheap fireworks against a hurricane. He died for nothing, for a hope that was just a statistical improbability. Magic is dead. The age of heroes is over. I will not die for a fairy tale. Her pain was a raw, open wound. He could feel it, a bitter cold that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. He understood her logic. It was the same cold logic the Overmind had used to break this world, and he knew he couldn't fight it with more logic. He took a deep breath. In my world, he began, his voice dropping, becoming quiet and intensely personal, we don't have magic. We have quirks. Powers born inside us. I was born without one. I was useless, a freak. Everyone told me I could never be a hero. That it was an impossible, foolish dream. Zatanna's hostile expression faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. But I met someone, Deku continued, his eyes unfocused, seeing a memory. The greatest hero of all. And he told me I could be a hero. He gave me his power, a sacred torch, passed down from one generation to the next, fueled by the hope of every person who ever held it. It's a power built on the fairy tale that one person can make a difference, that it is our duty to try, especially when it's impossible. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the counter, his green eyes burning with a sincerity she hadn't seen in anyone ever. I don't know if we can win. I don't know if we can beat Luther. I don't even know if I can survive in this world. But I know that when someone is hurting, you help them. It's not a choice. It's not about the odds. It's the whole point. That's what being a hero is. As he spoke, a strange energy filled the dusty shop. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was a warm, golden resonance that seemed to emanate from his very soul. The raw, undiluted hope of one for all, the combined will of 9 generations of heroes, was pouring out of him with his words. Zatanna felt it. As a homo magi, she was sensitive to the ambient magical energies of the world. She was used to the background hum of the earth's ley lines, the sharp tang of demonic residue, the cold void of cosmic entities. This was different. This was a power that felt like sunshine after a long winter, like the first breath after nearly drowning. It was pure, untainted, vibrant life. It was mana in its most primordial, hopeful form. On a high shelf behind the counter, a thick, leather-bound book, its cover embossed with silver runes she had never been able to decipher, began to react. The runes, dormant for decades, started to emit a soft, golden glow, humming in harmony with the power radiating from the strange boy before her. It was one of her father's most cherished possessions, a tome he could never open. The glow faded as Deku finished speaking, leaving the shop in its dusty silence once more. Zatanna stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cynical wall she had built around herself for 5 years had just been struck by a battering ram of pure, unadulterated heroism. She had felt that power. She had seen the book react. Everything she had forced herself to believe was a lie was being challenged by this impossible, earnest child, and it terrified her more than the Overmind ever had. She needed him gone. Now. Before that feeling, that treacherous flicker of hope, could take root. She straightened up, her face becoming a cold, emotionless mask. A pretty speech, she said, her voice brittle. You should write greeting cards. Now get out of my shop. Your fairy tales have no place here. She turned her back on him, busying herself with a stack of books, refusing to meet his eyes. She heard him hesitate, then the soft sigh of his departure. The bell on the door chimed, and he was gone. The shop was silent again. But the silence was different. It was no longer peaceful. It was charged. Zatanna stood frozen for a long moment, her hands trembling. Slowly, she looked up at the high shelf. At the book. The runes were dark again, but she could still feel the faint, residual warmth on its cover. A single, traitorous tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. "Damn you," she whispered to the empty room. "Damn you for making me feel this." The penthouse office atop Luthor Corp Tower in Metropolis was less a workspace and more a monument to a singular, indomitable ego. From its panoramic windows, the city sprawled out like a circuit board of Lex Luthor's own design, its lights twinkling in the encroaching twilight. Every pulse of energy, every transaction, every byte of data flowed through systems he had built, patented, or bought. He saw not a metropolis of millions of individual lives, but a single, complex organism that he, and he alone, knew how to properly conduct. Lex Luthor stood before the expanse of glass, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid held loosely in one hand. He was a man sculpted from ambition, his sharp suit a second skin, his bald head gleaming under the recessed lighting like a polished stone. On a holographic display shimmering in the air beside him, a dozen video feeds played simultaneously, all focused on one subject, the green-clad vigilante, Deku. There he was, pulling a family from a collapsing building in Biloxi. There he was again, a grainy cell phone video showing him stopping a high-speed chase in Mobile. And again, a high-resolution news feed from Pensacola, where he'd single-handedly prevented a chemical spill at the port. The public sentiment analysis graphs scrolling along the bottom of the display were trending in a direction Lex found profoundly irritating. Words like hope, hero, and inspiration were climbing at an exponential rate. "He's moving west," Lex mused, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He took a slow sip of his drink. Systematic. Predictable. He follows disaster like a carrion bird, but instead of feeding, he tidies up. It's offensively quaint. His assistant, Mercy Graves, stood silently by the obsidian desk, her posture ramrod straight, her expression impassive. "Sir, the media is calling him the Emerald Hurricane. His approval ratings in the Gulf states are higher than any elected official." "They're higher than yours." Luthor's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. It wasn't about approval. It was about control. For years, he had meticulously crafted a world recovering from the shadow of the Superman. He had positioned Luthor Corp as the beacon of humanity's self-reliance, the engine of its future. He was the one who funded infrastructure, who provided security, who pushed the boundaries of science. He was the hero the world needed, a human hero, grounded in logic and capital, not alien whimsy. This child, this Deku, was a narrative contagion. He operated outside the system. He answered to no one. He offered hope for free, a commodity Lex believed should be tightly regulated and distributed through proper, Luthor-owned channels. An uncontrolled symbol was a dangerous thing. It gave people ideas. It threatened the delicate, profitable order he had built. "A hurricane can be redirected, Mercy," Luthor said, turning from the window. The hologram swiped to two personnel files, their faces hard and predatory. "A hurricane can be contained. He's heading for New Orleans. The city's energy grid is one of our most sensitive assets. It would be a shame if it were to experience a hostile takeover attempt." The first file was Leslie Willis, codenamed Livewire. A former shock jock whose body had been transformed into living electricity. She was volatile, attention-seeking, and possessed a power that was pure, chaotic energy. Perfect for a televised spectacle. The second file was John Corbin, or Metallo. A soldier of fortune whose broken body had been housed in a near-indestructible robotic shell. His defining feature, however, was the power source nestled in his chest cavity. When Superman was the world's primary concern, it had been a shard of pure, green kryptonite. But Superman was gone. The world, Luthor had reasoned, still needed a contingency. "The core in Corbin," Lex stated. "Has it been recalibrated as per my specifications?" "Yes, sir," Mercy confirmed. "The synthetic kryptonite crystal has been refined. It no longer emits the specific radiation frequencies harmful to a Kryptonian physiology. Instead, it's tuned to produce a broad-spectrum, high-energy particle wave. Highly disruptive to exotic biological energy signatures. Our simulations predict it will have a debilitating effect on the subject's unique metabolism. It should overload his system, causing extreme pain, power fluctuations, and eventual systemic failure. Excellent! Luther smiled, a cold, predatory expression. He wasn't simply trying to replicate a weakness, he was inventing a new one, tailored specifically for his target. It was a statement of intellectual dominance. Deputize them. Issue a statement. Luther Corp Public Security Division, in cooperation with federal authorities, is moving to apprehend a dangerous, unregistered metahuman. Frame him as a threat to national infrastructure, a rogue element whose unpredictable power puts civilian lives at risk. He gestured to the screen. I don't want him beaten, Mercy. I want him discredited. I want him on his knees live, for the entire world to see. I want them to see their emerald hurricane reduced to a summer squall. And then, I want them to see me, offering him a path to legitimacy. Under my employ, of course. A collar, not a crown, Mercy nodded. And if he resists? Lex Luthor turned back to the window, watching the endless flow of traffic below. Then the collar becomes a leash. And if he breaks the leash, well, every pet needs to be put down eventually. See to it. The air in New Orleans was thick enough to drink. It was a humid, soupy blend of magnolia blossoms, chicory coffee, stale beer, and the faint, sweet scent of decay that clung to the ancient stones of the French Quarter. For Izuka Midoriya, it was intoxicatingly, overwhelmingly alive. After weeks of moving through the scarred and weary landscapes of the Gulf Coast, the vibrant, chaotic energy of this city was a balm to his soul. He sat on a wrought iron bench in Jackson Square, a half-eaten beignet covered in a mountain of powdered sugar resting in his lap. Before him, the St. Louis Cathedral stood proud and timeless, its spires reaching for a sky painted in the soft hues of a bruised peach. A jazz trio was playing on the corner, the mournful cry of a saxophone weaving a spell over the tourists and locals milling about. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Deku wasn't analyzing threat vectors or listening for the telltale rumble of a collapsing building. He was just Izuku, a teenager from Japan, marveling at a world that was so much bigger and stranger than he had ever imagined. It's so different from home, he thought, his mind, for once, not racing with strategic calculations. The music, the food, the way people talk. It's loud and a little messy, but it feels happy. Resilient. He had learned that word, resilient, from an old woman in a fishing village east of here whose home had been washed away by a storm surge. She'd lost everything, yet she'd smiled at him, offered him a bottle of water, and said, "The Gulf gives and the Gulf takes. We're still here. We're resilient." That spirit was everywhere in New Orleans. It was in the laughter spilling from the open doors of bars on Bourbon Street, in the intricate ironwork of the balconies that seemed to defy gravity, in the very rhythm of the city that pulsed with a life force all its own. He felt a pang of homesickness, a longing for his mother's katsudan, for the familiar skyline of Muzidafu, for the faces of his friends. But there was something else, too. A sense of purpose that had solidified from a desperate hope into a hardened resolve. He was needed here. He could make a difference. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, a genuine, tired smile on his face. He felt the vestiges within one for all, a silent, watchful council. They were quieter these days, a settled presence rather than a chaotic storm. They seemed to approve. His danger sense, the gift from the fourth user, Haikyuu Shinomori, was a low, background hum. It was always there, a subtle thrum of potential threats in a city of this size, a pickpocket here, a drunkard spoiling for a fight there. But it was calm. Unalarming. Until it wasn't. It came without warning, not a prickle but a piercing scream directly in his skull. It was a spike of pure, imminent peril so sharp and so vast it made him gasp, dropping the beignet. Powdered sugar puffed into the air like a ghost. Simultaneously, the world went silent. The saxophone sputtered out. The cheerful chatter of the crowd died. The lights in the shops lining the square flickered, dimmed, and then extinguished. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers as the entire French Quarter was plunged into an unnatural, oppressive darkness, broken only by the fading twilight. A high-pitched, electric crackle filled the air, the sound of a billion angry hornets. It was accompanied by the sharp, metallic smell of ozone. From the rooftops above, a figure descended, not falling, but riding a controlled bolt of lightning. She landed in the center of the square, her body crackling with incandescent blue energy, her spiky black hair seeming to defy gravity. Her eyes, glowing with the same electric malice, scanned the crowd. Well, well, well. Livewire's voice boomed, amplified by the very air around her, crackling from every street lamp and metal sign. Look at all the little roaches scurrying when the lights go out. Don't worry, folks. The exterminator's here. I'm looking for a particularly green pest. Heard he's been making a real buzz around here. Deku was already moving. One for all flooded his limbs, green lightning arcing around him, a stark contrast to Livewire's malevolent blue. Everyone, get back, he yelled, his voice cutting through the rising panic. Get inside. Get away from the square. His first priority, as always, was the civilians. He used a burst of speed, a miniature whirlwind that herded panicked tourists toward the shelter of the cathedral's massive doors. Livewire laughed, a sound like failing transformers. There he is! The Boy Scout of the Bay. Always putting the little people first. How predictable. She raised her hands, and twin arcs of lightning shot out, not at Deku, but at the iron lampposts flanking him. The post exploded, sending superheated shrapnel flying toward a group of street performers who were frozen in terror. Deku reacted without thinking. He pushed off the ground, a blur of motion. Manchester smash. He brought his leg down in a devastating axe kick, not on Livewire, but on the air in front of the performers. The resulting shockwave was a solid wall of force, deflecting the deadly shrapnel harmlessly into the stone facade of a nearby building. He landed in a crouch between the villain and the civilians, his eyes narrowed. My fight is with you. Leave them out of it. Oh, but that's no fun. Livewire cackled, her form dissolving into pure energy. She zipped through the air, reappearing behind him in a flash of blue light. You can't punch lightning, kid. You can't outrun a current. She was right. Every move he made was a fraction too slow. She wasn't a physical opponent he could grapple with. She was an elemental force. He dodged a bolt that melted the stone bench where he'd been sitting moments before. He used air force to counter a wide-area burst of static, creating a pocket of safety for people still fleeing. He was on the back foot, completely reactive. Her electricity was a perfect counter to his close-range style, forcing him to keep his distance while she controlled the entire battlefield. Think, Izuku, think, he muttered, the old habit flaring up under pressure. Her power flows through conductive materials. The grid is down, so she's her own power source. Can I ground her? The soil here must be damp, close to the water table. But how do I get her to stay still? She's too fast, she can just turn into energy and move. As if summoned by his thoughts of the ground, the very cobblestones beneath his feet trembled. A deep, rhythmic thump, 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 echoed through the square, growing louder, heavier. It wasn't the sound of an earthquake. It was the sound of footsteps. Impossible footsteps. From the shadows of a side alley, a figure emerged that made the blood run cold in Deku's veins. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, a hulking behemoth of gunmetal gray plating and exposed hydraulics that hissed with every step. Its head was a cruel, metallic skull with glowing red optics for eyes. But the most terrifying feature was the glowing, sickly green heart of the machine, visible through a reinforced plate in its chest. It hummed with a menacing, alien energy. Metallo. Target acquired. The automaton's voice grated, a synthesized baritone devoid of all emotion. Orders are to capture. Lethal force authorized upon non-compliance. Livewire hovered in the air, grinning victoriously. Meet my new partner Greenie. He's the muscle, I'm the flash. A match made in hell, courtesy of our sponsor, Lex Luthor. Luthor. The name hit Deku like a physical blow. Of course. This wasn't random chaos. This was a calculated, corporate-sponsored attack. As Metallo stomped forward, Deku's danger sense went from a scream to a full-body seizure. It wasn't just warning him of the physical threat. It was warning him about the thing in Metallo's chest. He felt it before he could process it. A strange wave of energy washed over him, emanating from the green core. It was invisible, intangible, but it felt like poison seeping into his very soul. One for all, usually a roaring inferno of power within him, sputtered. The familiar warmth felt, chilled. The green lightning arcing around his body flickered violently, some of it turning a sickly, unstable yellow. A wave of profound nausea and vertigo crashed over him. His muscles, moments ago coiled springs of immense power, suddenly felt like lead. What is this? He thought, gritting his teeth as he stumbled back a step. It's not radiation as I know it. It's like it's introducing static into my connection with the vestiges. He could feel them, the previous users of One for All, in the back of his mind. They weren't screaming in pain, but in alarm, their collective consciousness recoiling from this foreign energy that sought to sever their link to him. Metallo charged, his speed belying his bulk. Deku, fighting through the crippling wave of sickness, pushed off, aiming a 5% Detroit smash at the robot's head. It was a blow that should have sent a normal villain flying. His fist connected with Metallo's jaw with a deafening clang. But the power behind it was muted, fractured. The robot barely rocked back on its heels. Its red eyes flared. Energy output decreased by 73%. Metallo's voice box droned. Subject is compromised. Its massive metal hand shot out and grabbed Deku's arm. The proximity to the kryptonite core intensified the effect tenfold. The world swam before Deku's eyes. The power of One for All felt like it was being siphoned out of him, leaving a hollow, aching cold. His own green lightning sputtered and died completely. What's the matter, hero? Livewire taunted, zipping around him like a vulture. Feeling a little under the weather? That's the Luthor Corp special. A little something Mr. L cooked up just for freaks like you. She fired a concentrated bolt of electricity that slammed into Deku's back. Without the protective aura of One for All, the full, agonizing force of the jolt tore through him. He cried out, his muscles convulsing uncontrollably. Metallo held him fast, a living Iron Maiden. He was trapped. His power was being drained and disrupted, his body was being electrocuted, and his will was beginning to fray. Through the haze of pain, he saw a family, a mother, a father, a small child clutching a teddy bear, huddled in the doorway of a praline shop, watching in wide-eyed horror. They were the ones he had been trying to protect. And now they were watching him fail. No, he thought, his vision tunneling. I can't. I won't. Metallo raised its other fist, the metal groaning as pistons engaged. The fist was the size of a small car engine. It was poised to deliver a blow that would undoubtedly crush him, a final, public execution. Lights out, kid! Livewire sang. The fist descended. Deku closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable impact, his last thought a desperate apology to All Might. And then, a voice cut through the square, a voice that was clear, feminine, and utterly commanding. It spoke words that made no sense, yet resonated with an impossible power that made the very air hum and warp. Tsilis ebot ton ro tsilis ebot. Time seemed to stutter. A wave of shimmering, violet energy, smelling faintly of old books and lavender, erupted from the direction of the cathedral steps. It wasn't an explosion of force like Deku would create. It was more elegant, more fundamental. It struck Metallo not as a projectile, but as a conceptual truth. The robot's unstoppable forward momentum simply ceased to be. Its downward crushing fist was suddenly moving sideways, as if its entire existence had been edited by an unseen hand. The hulking automaton was flung violently across the square, tearing through iron benches and a street artist's cart before crashing into the brick wall of a Creole restaurant with a sound like a subway train, derailing. Deku collapsed to his knees, gasping, the pressure from the kryptonite core gone. He looked up, his vision blurry. Standing on the cathedral steps, silhouetted against the ancient stone, was a woman. She was dressed in a performer's tuxedo, complete with a top hat perched jauntily on her head, fishnet stockings, and thigh-high boots. A red flower was pinned to her lapel. Her hands were glowing with the same soft, violet light, and her eyes seemed to hold the secrets of the cosmos. Zatanna Zatara had entered the fray. She lowered her hands, the arcane glow fading. She looked from the crumpled form of Metallo to the kneeling, exhausted Deku, and then to a bewildered Livewire hovering in the air. A small, knowing smirk played on her lips. She met Deku's wide, disbelieving eyes. "You're real pain, you know that?" she said, her voice laced with the weary amusement of someone whose evening show had just been spectacularly interrupted. "I was in the middle of a sold-out performance. Deku could only stare. Magic. Real, honest-to-goodness magic. It was something out of a fantasy story, yet the proof was embedded in a brick wall across the square. Livewire recovered first, her shock turning to rage. Who the hell are you? Some kind of party magician? Something like that. Zatanna replied coolly, adjusting the cuffs of her jacket. She gave Deku a quick, appraising glance. Can you stand, Green Bean? The show's not over, and these hecklers need to be removed from the stage. The strange, debilitating sickness was already receding now that Metallo was at a distance. Strength, warm and familiar, began to trickle back into Deku's limbs. He pushed himself shakily to his feet. Thank you, he stammered, his mind struggling to categorize this new, impossible variable. Her powers are electricity-based. She can dissolve and reform. The big one, the green rock in his chest, it weakens me. It disrupts my quirk. Zatanna raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Quirk? Cute name. Alright, Sparky, you deal with Tin Man. I'll handle the light show. Before Deku could formulate a plan, she was already acting. Livewire shrieked and unleashed a torrent of lightning, a storm of blue death aimed directly at Zatanna. Xerxnart ot 9th go morph mrof ignorp. Zatanna chanted, making a complex gesture with her fingers. The air in front of her shimmered. The billion-volt attack didn't impact his shield, it simply changed. The crackling, violent energy transformed mid-flight into a flock of iridescent, shimmering butterflies made of pure light. They fluttered harmlessly around her head before dissolving into nothing. Livewire stared, her jaw agape. Did you just turn my lightning into butterflies? Stagecraft, Zatanna said with a wink. The sheer impossibility of it gave Deku the opening he needed. The duet had begun. While Zatanna held Livewire's full, furious attention, Deku focused on the recovering Metallo. The robot was pushing itself out of the wall, its red optics glowing with renewed fury. The sickening energy washed over Deku again, but this time he was prepared for it. He knew he couldn't fight it head-on with brute strength. His power was still fluctuating, unreliable. He had to be smarter, faster. Their powers work in completely different ways. Deku's analytical mind kicked into high gear, the familiar muttering starting under his breath. Her power seems to rewrite reality on a small scale, based on spoken commands. It's not about force, it's about definition. She defines his attack as something else. So I don't need to overpower Metallo, I just need an opening. She can create one. Magician lady! Deku yelled, his voice strained as he dodged a clumsy but powerful swing from Metallo. His armor is too strong. I can't break it while that core is active. I need to get it out. Zatanna, who was currently weaving a cage of glowing purple runes around a screaming Livewire, glanced over. Be specific, kid. My art requires direction. The chest plate. Can you make it weaker? Brittle? A grin flashed across her face. Now that's a fun little request. A bit of theatrical alchemy. Let's see. Sailor ot lays siht assabed. She thrust a hand toward Metallo. A beam of violet light, not forceful but insidious, struck the robot's chest. The reinforced ala around the kryptonite core didn't shatter or melt. Instead, it seemed to lose its integrity, flaking away at the edges like rusted iron, its color dulling to a dead, leaden gray. Metallo paused, its internal sensors registering the structural failure. Warning! Chest plate integrity compromised. That was all the invitation Deku needed. He pushed one for all through the lingering sickness, focusing it. He didn't need 100%. He didn't even need 20%. He just needed precision. From his fingertips, tendrils of crackling black energy erupted. Black whip! The dark tendrils shot forward, bypassing Metallo's flailing arms. They were not a blunt instrument this time, but fine, dexterous appendages. They slithered through the newly created cracks in the weakened chest plate, ignoring the solid metal and wrapping directly around the humming, synthetic kryptonite core at its heart. The moment they made contact, a feedback loop of agonizing energy shot up the black whip strands and into Deku's arm. It was 1,000 times worse than the ambient field, a direct, concentrated dose of the power-disrupting radiation. He screamed, his arm feeling like it was being simultaneously frozen and burned. The vestiges roared in protest. But he held on. His grip, physical and metaphysical, was absolute. Get out! He roared. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he yanked his arm back. There was a horrific screech of tearing metal and snapping wires. The synthetic kryptonite core was ripped from Metallo's chest, trailing sparks and coolant fluid. The moment it was free, the robot's red eyes flickered and died. The massive metal body froze for a second before collapsing backward, an empty, lifeless shell. It crashed to the ground with a deafening finality. The oppressive, sickening energy field vanished instantly. One for All came roaring back to life within Deku, a tidal wave of warmth and power that washed away the cold. The green lightning around him flared brighter than ever. He landed, panting, the glowing green crystal held at arm's length by a single tendril of black whip. The thing was still humming, pulsing with a malevolent light. Across the square, Zatanna finished her own part of the duet. Livewire, seeing her partner fall, let out a final, enraged scream and unleashed all her power in a massive nova of electricity. Fly HTNITUC ab livri wap RUOY, Zatanna declared, pointing a single finger at the epicenter of the blast. The explosion of energy inexplicably split down the middle, a perfect line of empty space bisecting it. The two halves of the electrical storm harmlessly impacted the buildings on either side of her, leaving her standing in a tranquil, untouched column of air. As the last of the energy dissipated, Livewire fell from the sky, her power completely spent, and collapsed in an unconscious heap. Silence descended upon Jackson Square once more. It was a silence filled with the smell of ozone, melted stone, and the faint, otherworldly scent of magic. The only sounds were Deku's ragged breaths and the distant wail of approaching sirens. The crowd, which had been watching from the safety of doorways and alleys, slowly began to emerge. They stared at the two defeated supervillains, at the cratered cobblestones, and then at the unlikely pair standing in the center of it all, the earnest, green-clad powerhouse and the enigmatic, tuxedoed magician. They weren't a team. They weren't an institution. They were just two people who had, against all odds, worked together to save them. A boy with impossible strength and a woman with impossible words. It was a sight no one had seen in years. Not since the age of heroes had supposedly ended. A tentative applause started, then grew louder, mixed with cheers and cries of relief. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated gratitude. Deku let Black Whip dissolve, the dangerous crystal falling to the ground with a soft thud. He looked over at Zatanna, his face a mixture of awe, exhaustion, and utter confusion. Zatanna gave him a tired, but genuine smile. She walked over, her heels clicking on the cobblestones, and magically produced a silk handkerchief, which she used to wipe a smudge of soot from his cheek. Not bad, Green Bean, she said softly. You've got heart. And a ridiculously powerful, what did you call it? A quirk? Thank you, Deku said, his voice hoarse. I couldn't have. I don't even know what you did, but thank you. I'm Izuku Midoriya, Zatanna Zatara, she replied, tucking the handkerchief away. She gestured vaguely at the mess. Well, this has been a memorable intermission. The city of New Orleans owes me for property damages and a ruined third act. She looked at him, her expression turning a bit more serious. That thing, she said, nodding at the crystal. It's not just technology. There's a sliver of bad magic woven into its matrix. Something old and greedy. That's Luther's real genius. He doesn't just build weapons, he finds ways to poison them. She tipped her hat to him. Stay on your toes, Izuku Midoriya. You've made a very powerful, very petty enemy tonight. He doesn't like it when his toys get broken. And with that, she took a theatrical bow to the cheering crowd, and with a flourish of her hands and a backwards spoken word, Sinev, she disappeared in a puff of purple smoke and a shower of glittering confetti. Deku stood alone in the center of the square as police cars and Luther Corp's security vehicles swarmed the area. He looked at the unconscious forms of Livewire and Metallo, then at the spot where Zatanna had vanished. He had won. They had won. But her warning echoed in his mind. This was just the beginning. Luther wasn't just a villain to be punched. He was a poison, and he was just getting started. For the first time, Deku understood that the greatest threat in this new world might not be a monster with a devastating power, but a man in a business suit, a man who could turn science, media, and even a hint of dark magic into a weapon aimed at the very heart of hope. Back in the pristine silence of his metropolis penthouse, Lex Luthor watched the news reports on his holographic display. The screen was split. On one side was the official Luthor Corp press feed showing his deputized agents being taken into custody by his own security teams for re-evaluation, the narrative already being spun into one of heroic sacrifice against a surprisingly powerful foe. On the other side was raw, chaotic cell phone footage from the crowd. He saw it all. The boy's power failing. Metallo's dominance. The planned perfect moment of capture. And then he saw her. The woman in the top hat. He saw impossible butterflies and a cage of runes. He saw his multi-billion-dollar weapon, powered by a marvel of tailored energy science, dismantled by a string of nonsensical, backwards words. Mercy stood by his desk, awaiting his fury. She expected him to smash his glass, to rage at the incompetence of his assets, to order a strike on this new variable. But Lex Luthor did not rage. He simply watched the footage of Deku and Zatanna, of might and magic, working in perfect, unrehearsed sync. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. It was a smile of genuine, intellectual delight. Well, he whispered to the city below. This is a far more interesting problem than I had anticipated. He hadn't just failed to put a collar on a rogue hero. He had accidentally orchestrated the birth of a duet. He had provided the stage, the villains, and the crisis. And in doing so, he had shown the world, and himself, that two disparate notes of hope, when played together, could create a symphony he had not accounted for. The problem wasn't the boy anymore. The problem was the potential for an orchestra. And Lex Luthor, ever the conductor, knew exactly what you did when the orchestra refused to play your song. You didn't just silence a single instrument. You burned down the entire concert hall.